welcome to Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, Intercultural Understanding in You with Karen Devonish-Mazzotta. My name is Kalpana McCann, and I'm your moderator for this session. The OTF Land Acknowledgement. We acknowledge first and foremost that we are gathered in the province of Ontario on the traditional territories of various Indigenous peoples who have been present on this land known as Turtle Island since time immemorial. We acknowledge that this has been a meeting ground for generations. We are grateful to the stewards and caretakers of this land. As advocates, teachers, and educators, we understand our collective responsibility to honor, protect, and sustain this land. We further recognize and honor within the membership of OTF those who are Indigenous to this land. This practice of recognizing the ancestral and traditional lands in which we work, live, and play is a concrete action that we undertake as a first step towards reconciliation between Canadians and the Indigenous peoples of this land. But it is not our only step. Collectively and individually, we must seek to denounce the injustices and the wrongs that have been committed against the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and to dedicate ourselves to cultivating and maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and trust. Our presenter for this session is Karen Devonish-Mazzotta. Karen has been teaching FSL for 27 years in the Toronto District School Board. She has a master's in second language learning from the University of Toronto. As a reviewer for the Ontario Ministry of Education, Karen has conducted equity and bias checks for several curriculum documents in both English and in French. In 2021, Karen received the McGillivray Award for, from CPF Ontario, given to individuals who have actively promoted the development of French second language learning in Ontario. Presently, she's a teacher-librarian with the Toronto District School Board and serves as a course director, Practicum Facilitator with York University's Faculty of Education, FSL Teacher Candidate Cohort. Please welcome Karen. Karen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kalpana. That was so sweet of you. Excellent. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Amazing. Can everybody see it? Yep.
Perfect.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you. And I'm so happy to get to be with you this evening. And I have to start by being totally honest. When I saw the advertisement for this session that I was going to give, I saw myself as framed as an expert teacher. And I was like, oh, who are they talking about? I thought that was really daunting because I have to say, I think it's been my exposure to really extraordinary teachers in my 28 years of teaching, Kalpana being one of them, and that they've really held me and brought me to where I am today. So I am so looking forward to learning with you in the next 90 minutes. And I want to express my sincere gratitude to all of you who are here in the space for investing in your own learning after a day of work. Like, that's a lot. Teachers are so amazing. And I think you are a demonstration of that, even being here tonight. So, all of the links and resources that I'm sharing with you tonight are saved in a file that Kalpana will share with you at the end of the evening. So if you see something and you're like, oh, I really want to know more about that, it is in a file that I'm going to share with you, or Kalpana is going to share with you at the end of the session. So I have to start with my bias. So my Guyanese parents were raised in a colonial environment that was and still is riddled with issues of racism, shadeism, and linguistic imperialism. And I'm very sensitive to the history of the colonial language that I've chosen to teach, that being French, and its role as a tool of oppression, but also as a tool of resistance as a minority language in Canada, and its role as oppression and resistance throughout the world. It's from that space of personal conflict that I speak to you today about my understandings of identity, intercultural understanding and awareness, as well as culturally relevant pedagogy. So, what did you sign up for today? Today, we're going to explore who you are as an educator, discover how your identities influence your pedagogies and your relationships with learners. We're going to take a deep dive into intercultural awareness and understanding. We're going to make connections with the tenets of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, intercultural understanding and awareness, and our language curriculum, both English and French. And we're going to learn to infuse these approaches in your classroom practices to enhance your teaching. Now, often when we talk about issues of culture, identity, oppression, dominance, supremacy, similarities and differences between people, some participants feel a little uncomfortable. And I've been in lots of presentations where the facilitator may suggest that the space where they're learning is a safe environment. I have to be honest with you. I don't think any environment can be 100% safe 100% of the time in all interactions. So I want us to sort of challenge ourselves to thinking, um, yes, it's important that a safe space is essential for building trust and establishing a sense of community, but it is a brave space where participants and individuals feel encouraged to speak up, to share their perspectives, even if it might be outside of the normal comfortable spaces that you're in. Um, and it might feel really challenging. So the first share I'm going to do with you today is actually shared as a QR code. So you can feel free to take a device and scan it. And it'll that shoot you off to an article written by Brian Araro and Christy Clemens called From Safe Spaces to Brave Spaces, a New Way to Frame Dialogue around Diversity and Social Justice. In this article, the authors propose the following guidelines for conversations in a brave space, and I'd like to consider us adopting those guidelines today. The first thing they suggest is that participants embrace controversy with civility. They ask that participants own their own intentions and their impact of what those intentions are. So be honest, but then know that the expression of that honesty may have impact. And that impact may be unintentional, but that you have to own that impact as well. The author suggests that participants should consider how their daily life or that of their students may be affected if you choose not to challenge yourself, if you choose not to engage today, if you choose not to participate honestly in the work to try to improve practice. Know that we have varied understandings of concepts of respect. What is yours? And finally, the author suggests that participants really believe and embrace that pointed challenges aren't necessarily attacks, and that uncomfortable feeling that someone may be experiencing is maybe somewhere where they need to do some work, and that a defensive reaction is not needed, but rather self reflection. So I hope that everybody is okay with these guidelines. Um, if anybody has any questions about them, feel free to write them in a chat. Unmute yourself. Let me know. And do you have anything you think we should add to these guidelines so that we're moving forward as a community of learners in the next few minutes? If everybody's okay with these guidelines, here's what I propose. On Zoom, you can use the reaction button. So you can actually do a thumbs up. Kalpana, I'll ask you if you can just check. If everybody has a thumbs up, then I'll move forward and keep on going. Kalpana, has everybody got a thumbs up?
No.
No.
Okay, so we've got a couple. There they go. Here they come.
Okay. Okay, good stuff. Great.
Okay.
Well, I want to get to know you a bit. So, our first activity is we're going to launch into identity, but I want to hear a little bit about you before I start talking about that. So, I'm providing a Slido. This is how Slido works. You can go to www.slido.com and punch in these numbers 4164859. And when you do that, you can tell me a little bit about, or you can let me know what school board you work in. So, um, I'm asking you to use the most popular capitalized acronym. So if you work for a board like Peel District School Board, you'll type in capital PDSB. There's a YRDSB, for example, which is awesome. Thank you. Who else is here from what board? There we go. Ottawa Carleton, welcome, welcome. Got some TDSB. I believe the way Slido works is that if you are TDSB and someone else is TDSB, and there's only one wire DSB, for example, the TDSB Oh, there we go. We've got a couple people from Ottawa Carleton. You see, it just happened just before I could even explain it to you. Um, that there are multiple people from a certain boards, and that's why the acronym would be bigger. So we've got a few teachers from Peel, from Ottawa Carleton. Welcome. Excellent. So I see 10 people participated. We'll give you about 30 seconds more. That's great. Well, welcome to everybody. Now I have a good sense of, what boards we're sort of representing here in the space, and that's great to know. Thank you. Second slide I'm going to provide for you is in which division do you work? So we've got early elementary, late elementary, secondary, post secondary. Same process. You can log on to www.slido, or you can also just scan in the QR code and respond. So we've got quite a few teachers. 80% of the group, or who have responded, are in elementary education. So that's great. I've got a lot of elementary examples, so that's good. But also late elementary as well. This is where the majority of my teaching actually was when I was in the classroom before I became a TL, was in grade 4 to 7, so that's awesome. Pretty good 50-50 split, so that's excellent, excellent to know. Thank you. So now that we know who's in the space, we're going to talk a little bit about identity. By examining ourselves, we better understand the complexities that encompass issues of inclusion in schools. Additionally, we'll better understand ourselves and identity with the feelings, ideas, thoughts, values, and opinions of the students, the families, the colleagues with whom we work and for whom we work. Dr. Daniel Yon, an anthropologist from the Faculty of Education at York, identifies two particular ways of defining identity. And I think it's really important for us to think about this, particularly when we think about how we frame identity, the identity of our students, and how we frame identity with our students. So, first, identity can be seen or understood as a fixed category, the representation of ourselves and others via particular attributes, or, for example, country of origin, nation, class, gender, origin, or ethnicity, in ways that can't be changed. Okay, so that's one way that people sort of talk about certain identities. I encourage you to take the time to do, this sort of type of activity, talking about identity with your students. And I'm going to propose two different ways you can do this. And I encourage you to do that for yourself, but also compare when you do it with your students, compare what your identities look like and how you think about identity and that of your students. Well, Jan proposes a second definition. He says that identity be seen as a process of identification. In this way, identity is defined as both continuous and incomplete, constructed and open, and it's always in constant movement. So you see the scribble that keeps moving is the other way that Jan describes identity, that it's in flux, that it depends on context, that it depends on time, that it depends on who you're with. So that's another way to think about identity. So, why are we doing these reflections? Because reflections on self identity are essential for teachers. Why is that? It forces us to consider our own personal and implicit and explicit biases, power and privilege that can lead to stereotyping and discrimination. As we explore some of these examples related to bias and their implications in the classroom, I'm asking you to consider how bias is directly related to your own belief systems and your values, and how that's impacted your teaching practice, how you interact with students, and how they approach the various courses, subjects, activities that you do with them. Okay. So I want you to consider um, what what are considerations for teaching and learning when you're working with students who have diverse experiences, different experiences and backgrounds than you do? And then I also want you to think about what are considerations that you have to have when you're teaching and learning with students who have similar experiences or backgrounds than you do. Okay, so while you're thinking about those questions, I'm just proposing, and this is one of the research pieces that I'll share with you in the resources, that People for Education did some work around teacher bias, implicit and explicit bias, specifically with regard to learning skills and work habits. And that research, what they did exactly is they looked at students' achievement using the EQAO test, and also they looked at their report cards as well, with regard to their achievement against the provincial criteria, provincial expectations. But then for those same students, they also looked at the assessments that the teachers made around their learning skills and work habits. What they found, the research is that when measured against achievement, students who identified as male, as racialized, as disabled, or students who are experiencing another socio-demographic disadvantage, such as poverty, may perform well academically, but are significantly less likely to be perceived as excellent learners by their teachers in learning skills and work habits, as opposed to students who identified as female, as white, as non disabled, or students living in sociodemographically privileged contexts. So, just before I continue, I want to know, like, what are your sort of thinking about what I've said so far around identity, around teachers doing their own, sort of self reflection about their identity, and how that compares against the identity of their students? And then some any or thoughts that you have around the research that I just shared. So feel free to just put up your hand or unmute yourself and let me know what thoughts you have so far.
Hi,
Hi there, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Very good.
That's good. I'm sorry, I'm driving. So
Oh, no worries. We'll start with your name.
my name is Donna Broomfield, and
Nice to meet you, Donna.
I didn't get to put in. Thank you. I didn't get to put in that I'm TDSP.
Oh, awesome. Well, away you go,
So
Donna. What do you think so far?
I agree with the study. I feel that first of all, when you talk about identity and how it is ever changing, I never really, to be honest, looked at it in that way. You grow up a certain way with certain values, and
Mhm.
you think that those values stick, and you never really see that your identity does, depending on who you come in contact with and the things you learn, how it does start to evolve and
Yeah.
change.
The benefits of online learning, I actually was able to start doing this stuff. Anyway, yeah. So, with the green Post-it, if you could type, like, what you do to get to know your student's identity. So I gave you an example there. I begin my year with a class interest survey. I see somebody wrote here, we have dialogue journal. We write back and forth every week, and it's an authentic way to get to know my students. Brilliant. So wonderful. Yeah. Have them bring in 3 or 4 things that's important to them and share and talk about. Amazing. We have kindergarten students bring in a family photo and draw to add to our classroom family tree. Really nice. People who are important to them. And then with the blue Post-it note, I'd like you to pop in, how do you use this information in your pedagogy? So we'll have green ones and we'll have blue ones. And the blue ones will say, when I plan, like, for example, I gave an example that, like, if I plan word problems, for example, for my classes, I use all that information that they gave me through the surveys or through my observations of them. And I try to contextualize the mathematics. So it's something that they're familiar with. And particularly if it's something where they're using math incidentally, I observe them doing that. I try to include that when I create a word problem just to make it more pertinent. And so I think it really also lets students know that we see them, we value them, we celebrate them, and it legitimizes who they are and what their identities are too. So that's great. It's awesome. I see somebody wrote here, first 20 days of social emotional learning. Okay, if somebody wants to unmute and like talk to that, I'm not sure what that means exactly, but I'd love to hear. In the interim, we have sharing circles where students talk about what they did over the weekend and then they write and draw them in their personal journals. Awesome for kindergarten. What kinds of things do you do to use this information in your pedagogy? You try to pick topics that would interest students for what we read. Amazing. I too, as well as a teacher librarian, absolutely get a sense for the kinds of books that they ask for, conversations that I have with them just incidentally. And then I try as much as possible to let that guide my book purchasing with the kids.
Karen, we have Shelley who's raised her hand. Shelley, do you want to unmute if you have a question?
Please.
I just want to talk about the first 20 days of social emotional learning.
Amazing.
Um, so we have it school-wise, and we have it sort of goes through, and identity is part of it. So we sort of talk to kids about their identity and where the identity comes from.
Mhm.
And then we cover other things like how to handle conflict, how to identifying your strengths and identifying your needs. So it's just a sort of a way at the beginning of the year for us to get to know our students better and also put that emphasis on the importance of social emotional learning.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. I see somebody wrote here, I use bio poems so that students can share how they see themselves. Does anybody want to quickly speak to bio poems?
Thanks, Karen. I can do that.
Yeah,
So,
great.
a bio poem is where it's framed with your first and last name, and then each line of the poem talks about things, how you see yourself in context of your relationships, what
Yeah.
your goals are, what your fears are, what your aspirations are, and what you hope to accomplish in life.
Wow.
And it's just and it ends with their last name, so it's a nice bookend activity, and it's great like on a parent teacher night because you can have that scrolling through so that everybody can get a sense of who our students are and the family that we've created in our classrooms.
I love it. And I love that sentence at the end, the family created. Thank you so much. I want you for sure to stay around for change poems because I have a little video about those. I think you're going to like those as well. And they speak to sort of also what we're talking about what people see in them, but what they see in themselves as well, that I think would be a really great compliment. Thank you for sharing. Oh, I want to read all of these, but I know we have to keep going. So this is what I'm going to propose. If we can't get to it tonight, I'm going to take the bit.ly and put it as a part of the resource, and then we are creating right here our own sort of guide about different ways that you can get to know your students identities and what you can do with them. Some of the what you can do is we didn't get to read all those, try to pick topics that students are interested in to read. Try to find other students who have similar interests, create clubs and groups, and use that information to engage them in learning that is relevant to them. That's so great. Integrate literacy materials connected to the students' interests and experiences. Like we're making our own little guide here about how to use identity and infuse it in our practice. So I just thank you so much. All of you continue to add to it because we'll share the link for the Jamboard and you can benefit from that. So I'm going to stop and then reshare for my presentation. Thank you for your participation. That's awesome. Okay, so I said we'd explore today about intercultural understanding, awareness, and competence. And you probably wonder, how the heck did she come up with that? Well, for those of you who are not FSL, why talk about this is because I stumbled on it when I was, enjoying. I really enjoyed the work of serving as an equity and bias checker for the Ministry of Education, and what that meant was that I was charged to read through drafts of revised curricula documents and locate, comment on, highlight areas that I may think that there was bias, implicit or explicit, discrimination or exclusion. And so one of the documents that I had to review was the French as a second language curriculum that came out in 2013 and 14. In the first draft of the FSL curriculum, it introduced new intercultural overall understanding overall and specific expectations, and that they weren't explicitly like sort of stated in previous ministry curriculum. So, where did the ministry come up with these intercultural understanding and awareness expectations? Well, they were following Ontario Ministry was following the movements of foreign language teachers that came to the forefront in Europe 20 years before. In the 1980s and a little bit in the late 80s, the unification of Europe gained momentum with the signing of the Single European Act. The purpose of this act was to create a single market and to encourage European countries to come together in pursuit of shared political and economic goals. So, foreign language teachers and researchers started to think about how this movement of people across borders in Europe, how that might impact their teaching and learning. So they developed this common European framework of reference for languages, which was published in 2001. This reference provided a comprehensive framework for teaching, language learning, teaching, and assessment across Europe. So, for example, if I were like a person who lived in France and I spoke French and I was learning German and I wanted to go work in Germany, I could go to Germany after having, sort of engaged in the assessment process using the CFR, and I could say, I'm a B2. And when I show up in Germany as a B2, because Germany as well was using these assessment levels that were common across Europe, they would say, okay, as a B2 communicator, I can expect that you have these certain competencies. So they were trying to like sort of standardize the assessment of language learning across languages. And now this has been adopted in quite a few parts of the world. Okay. So, like I said, language teachers began to think about how they have to address not only learning new languages in preparation for moving to another linguistic context, but they also had to think about how their own country could prepare to receive learners from other contexts and who may have their own ways of knowing and being, not only linguistically, but otherwise. So, this gentleman's name is Dr. Michael Biram. And one of the quotes he has in developing intercultural competence is the base is saying that the basis of intercultural competence is in the attitudes of the person interacting with people from another culture. So Dr. Biram and his colleagues came up with this model called the intercultural competence model. It's a big lot to say. Um, and that that was developed as part of the CFR. This model is to outline key components that teachers thought were necessary in preparation for students who are learning a new language to go into a new linguistic and cultural context. So I won't read all of them to you, but or tell you more about them because it's quite in detail. But the kinds of things that they said that they were trying to develop in students was thinking about their attitudes about going to a new context, having some knowledge of other social groups, working on their skills of interpreting and relating to others, having a critical cultural awareness, working on their skills of discovery, and being able to suspend disbelief about other cultures and to think about their own biases and be curious and open. Okay. When I looked at this, it made me think of all the work that I had done in equity spaces years before. It made me think of the work of James Banks. It made me think of the work of Gloria Gilman. And it certainly made me think of the work of Gloria Lanson Billings, Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, that we're going to talk about today. So, the way I conceptualize the elements of Biram's intercultural competence model is to develop a mindset for interacting, communicating, understanding, respecting, and making community with others. To be honest with you, when I think of intercultural, I want to focus more on the inter. So what's the inter? The inter is what we teach students about we're teaching actions, we're stimulating the development of a mindset, we're asking them to check their bias, to understand oppression, to analyze perspective, their own perspective and that of others, to engage in critical literacy and in equity literacy. Um, and to start with the self as the subject and then move from self so that they can start to understand others, moving from one complex identity to the other, the familiar to the unfamiliar. And thinking about identity, as I showed you in that scribble, that Dan Young proposes as elusive and emerging. Okay. So I was not so interested in culture, and I'll tell you why. Because culture is always contradictory and it's complex and it has lots of interpretations. It's messy, and there's no one definition of culture. It's very challenging in all sorts of reasons. And because I ask questions like, who's the interpreter of a culture? Who's the creator of culture? It's what is the context, and what are the power dynamics? So to define culture in one way is very hard to do. So when we're in classrooms, we're not teaching simple cultural facts. In fact, we know that teaching simple cultural facts will be biased, it'll probably promote stereotype, and it'll be essentialist. And this is what I'm showing you today about, definitions of essentialism. So we're aiming to frame others with whom we communicate and learn about and experience with nonsense essentialist lens. So take an example of the term Canadian. So an essentialist view of Canadian is associating that terminology with a country, and then having all those attributes of that whatever that culture is in opposition to others. But we know as Canadians that that definition is not static. That's a very different one to the other. So that's an essentialist view of culture. A non-essentialist view of culture is proposing or positioning culture as complex, difficult to pin down the characteristics, making it very dynamic and flowing and changing and intermingling. And I think in that way, we really help students to understand that identities are also very complex. And I want you to notice how on the left, essentialist views of cultures really resembles like Dr. Yon's one way of looking at identity as static, and non-essentialist views as dynamic is sort of resembles how he refers to the other definition of identity. So I believe that intercultural understanding and awareness learning demands that students and their educators ask themselves effective questions to interpret information, detect bias and fixed and essential messages, and consider the perspectives of others. So, how do we set the conditions for intercultural understanding and awareness and competence to thrive? Like, what do we have to do to make this practical in a teaching context? Because all that other stuff is so heady, right? Well, I think that Gloria Lanson Billings really gives us the way forward. Okay. So this is a model, a stance that we can aspire to. And she called this culturally relevant pedagogy. So I have to tell you the story of Gloria Lanson Billings and her research because I think it's a good story of a researcher that tried to do something different. At the time in the 90s, a lot of the research that was coming out about Black students in the States was always very deficit, had a very deficit lens, what they couldn't do, what they weren't doing, what sort of states or departments really wanted them to do and they weren't achieving. And she took an asset-based lens to students and to teachers that were thriving and surviving in school districts where teachers and students were feeling good and confident and academically killing it. Even though in those spaces, there was still that sentiment of Black students being unable, unwilling, and unfit. And she looked very closely doing an ethnographic study of those students and families and teachers who were doing quite well academically and feeling confident in the face of very negative views. And she tried to understand what they were doing. So she looked at 8 teachers very closely in different parts of the district, so they didn't know each other. And she saw some commonalities that were happening in these 8 classrooms. And she's distilled those commonalities and said that there are 3 things that were very common. Okay. And she called that culturally relevant pedagogy. What did she notice first? She noticed that teachers had very high academic expectations and success for their students. Lance and Billings observed that an effective teacher must hold high expectations for all students and provide the support necessary so that all learners experience academic success consistently with their time with that teacher, not just a one-off, it was consistent. Some of them had to do with the teacher's own self-reflection, like are do we hold certain deficit views for students? And those deficit views, is that the reason why the students are not able to find themselves successful? Um, for which students do we not see all of their identity, value it, celebrate it? Is it our lack of ability to see those students? Is that the reason why they're not contributing? It may be contributing to the student's lack of success. I believe that that disruption starts with us as teachers, our own minds, our own beliefs of who can and cannot, who will be successful and who won't in our classrooms. How much importance do you place on assessment as the self-evaluation when students are talking about how they think they're doing? How much value do you put in that in order to build student competence and confidence? Why are we always the external evaluator? So, can we constantly and consistently engage students in self assessment and goal setting? Okay. Those were things that she noticed that these teachers did consistently. Lanson Billings observed that in her research, the 8 teachers she did the ethnographic study with harnessed cultural competence. She observed that they viewed the families and the communities from where the kids came as valuable resources and spaces for the teacher's professional development. Teachers needed to learn how to view community working with, learning from, and contributing to as an asset to their own learning, and to learn how to teach students best based on that learning. So, we as teachers have to see student lived experience, and you might say culture, as an asset. Students come to our classroom with their own ways of knowing and being. And I think one of our participants on this call was talking to that we need to create conditions where students feel welcome and valued and celebrated and seen. And in those circumstances, students are more likely to be engaged and feel like they belong. So we have to be critical about our own assumptions about cultures and experiences, student potential, and what students offer to the experience of interculturalism. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Patrick Solomon as a high school student. He was actually one of our high school mentors in a really cool, he called it at the time, multicultural leadership camp, where they brought together kids from all over, at that time, Etobicoke Board, to do leadership activities and to effectuate change in our communities. And at that time, Patrick Solomon was working on his PhD and became a professor at York University, and I got to meet him again and learn from him when I became a course director in my career. And Patrick always said that in order to harness family and student cultural competence, we have to establish and foster trusting relationships that'll allow for mutual exchange. We have to really get to know those aspects under the waterline of the identity iceberg to develop intercultural skills that will help us assume a mindset that student and community experience can teach us how to better teach students. Patrick, this quote is directly from him. Teachers need to know more than the 3 R's. And here he's talking about race in particular, learning about race from community, and saying to teachers, he said, if you don't know the community your students live in, the social, the racial dynamics, you won't be as effective. Teachers aren't meant to be tourists in the neighborhood that they teach. Finally, Lanson Billing observed that teachers in her study consistently demonstrated why critical consciousness is and was so necessary for schools. Students and teachers developed critical consciousness through challenging the status quo of the current social order. Critical consciousness highlights systems of oppression, injustice, inequity, and it should transform thought and moves to action to intentionally dismantle and eradicate sources of injustices. Critical consciousness is the aspect of CRP that I observe in going to different schools, seeing my teacher candidates, that teachers do the least of with regard to culturally relevant pedagogy. And it's really too bad because that's the most important aspect. And so much of critical consciousness drives and impacts academic success and cultural competence. Lancet Billings used the words of Paulo Freire, as you would see on the slide, when speaking about the influence that schools can have on society in general if teachers allow students to question the norms, the morals, the values that produce inequalities in our society. Schools can and should serve as places of destabilization, of disruption. We need to push back the status quo. I mean, imagine the possibilities in society if that actually happened um, in our classrooms. I have to say, an experience I had today, and I was telling Kalpana about it. We invited Civics Canada through Rep Day to have an MP speak up close and possible with our students, our local MP. And to date, watching the students feel confident enough to ask questions about, what is the federal government doing about issues of housing for new Canadians here in our riding. Like, to hear them ask that question, and it really was spontaneous, was just so much of, to me, a reification of critical consciousness coming out of the mouths of a grade 5 and putting them in the position to be able to speak to somebody who has the ear of the prime minister is so important, to give the kids the chance to realize their critical consciousness and really validate their thinking, knowing that their thoughts will speak truth to power. So, I've talked too much. I want to hear from you. Here are 4 examples of ways that you could develop critical consciousness with your students. There are others, but here's an example of 4. Disrupting the commonplace, interrogating multiple viewpoints, focusing on social political issues, and taking action and promoting social justice. So, if you go to this bit.ly, and I'll copy and put it in the chat in a second, what I actually want you to do is just to write your initials in which of these quadrants you think you've done well or observed somebody else do well in developing critical consciousness. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do that. And then I'm going to look at the initials and ask the person who has those initials in whichever quadrant to sort of share what they're doing or what they've observed. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And I'm going to put in oops. The chat bit.ly. There's the bit.ly. Believe found it. Then I'm going to share again and go to critical consciousness and you. Yeah. So if you just want to open up a text box, you can even take my text box and copy it. And then just put your initials in. Which of the quadrants do you think you've demonstrated the development of critical consciousness with your learners? Give you a couple minutes to do that. So I see here GF, interrogating multiple viewpoints. Can I ask that person to either unmute themselves or type in the chat? How have you done that with learners in an effort to develop their critical consciousness?
I have a grade 2 free class,
Yeah.
and well, just looking at that, the things that they, let's say, share about their weekends or about their life, and we look at it. What if it wasn't you? What if it was someone else, let's say from another place, or from
Yeah.
another city, or from another with the grade 2s, as we are learning about different countries or different cultures. So we talked about, what if this was a different person? How would they look at the one that you shared, that you shared now? What would their experience be in that in that um, in that family situation, or in that life situation that they shared?
Right. Excellent. And I love that. I think what's so important is to confirm those assumptions, but also to refute them too. And I love that about being in a library where there's like 22,000 resources. I find lots of different ways where kids might say, "Oh, I think, a certain person would be so different from me," but then giving them the opportunity to explore, hearing the voice of that person, and they actually find that maybe they're not as different as they thought. So that's really amazing. Thank you very much. And I like that you're doing with very young learners. And I have some examples of that a little bit later, just before we go, when I show you examples from the classroom, that very young people are able to interrogate and see things from multiple perspectives. Thank you. How about somebody from taking action and promoting social justice? Casey, maybe?
Hi, so I teach grade one French immersion.
Yeah.
So usually, I take some examples from the situations where, the students are kind of taking place. For example, they are sometimes, they, I remember one student said, I'm not going to play with that person because that person has different skin color. And then
Mhm.
that comments really made me kind of, kind of upset
Yeah.
personally. And then, I took that conversation into my group, class, discussions, and then
Mhm.
what kind of, um, point of view we should take, or
Mhm.
how should we consider others,
Right.
what is our uniqueness and what is the difference, and why should we respect, no regardless our, the colors. And then
Yes.
I from that kind of incident, I really realized that there are lots of influence from their, families and
Yes.
their cultural, background. And that's
Mhm.
why, even in grade ones, they already had the kind of, prejudice, or kind of, um, a stereotype of, or kind of thought. And then
Absolutely.
I was very shocked of
Yeah.
that. So, really, I try to promote the fairness, and then
Mm.
not the fairness, just the respect
Mhm.
each other. And then from that point of view, we have to start. So I really focus on respecting each other, and then uniqueness, and then difference. So from there, I try to read kind of, many books who can show our what is our really justice. And then last month, I remember I read I am just three what was that? Just a little girl who just she studied the name
Mhm.
with her name. I, oh my gosh, my memory is terrible.
No, that's
But
okay.
anyway, that is the black girl.
Mhm.
And then she moved. She was in the black school, but she was the first person. Oh yeah, my name is Ruby.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
to see Ruby. And then, so, I read that book. And then from there, we had really, active discussion on why, that girl felt, what can we do? That kind of, social justice, it was a starting point, but little
Mhm.
by little, I tried to promote that.
Yeah, and I thank you so much for sharing it. I like that you integrated, um, a story that is authentic as a part of it, and that you continue to think about having counter stories as well of framing, Blackness in positive ways, in order for students to understand that, we do have a legacy of anti-Black racism. That is real. And I like also, you're going to find very interesting the research that I'm going to share in a couple minutes around race and age, because I've heard many times in my 28 years teachers at the age level that you teach and say, oh, they don't know race at grade one. Well, you'll see that and lots of research has been done to demonstrate that kids understand and can replicate racism before they even hit us as an institution in JK and SK. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So thank you very much for sharing the story of your students and how you took action. That's brilliant. Can we have one more story, maybe from focusing on sociopolitical issues, either SD or GF?
I can talk to, hopefully this is what you mean by it. So I'm, as well as teaching grade 6, I'm the sort of eco lead at our school, and I run an eco club. And
Yes.
every month we have a different theme or topic that we cover. So what happens is we create sort of a slide deck or a presentation, and then students take it back to their classroom. So
Okay.
we have had a focus on environmental racism,
Yes.
and having students understand that as part of systematic racism, there is such a thing as environmental racism.
My gosh, so you've read Ingrid Waldron's book.
I haven't, but I will. Ingrid Wald. All right.
Karen, we lost you again. Can't hear you. Nope.
How's this one?
Better.
Okay, I'll try one more time. You've
Okay, so
read Ingrid Waldron's book, right?
and what's the book? What's the book's name? And I can look it up quickly.
There's something in the water.
Oh, I have not read it, but I am
Oh,
going
it's
to.
exciting, it's exciting. I am in discussions with her about making this book for kids. Because as a teacher librarian, I read it and I got all excited and went, I can't use this with my JKSKs. So that, Sheila, we need to talk. We need
Oh,
to get in
okay.
touch. Yes. And you need to get There's Something in the Water by Ingrid
I've
Waldron.
written it down. It's on my list. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
there's a movie about it, everything.
We lost you again.
Karen, we've lost you again.
Can you hear me now? I only got
Yes.
half an hour,
Yeah.
and then you guys can mute me.
Okay.
Elliot Page read the book and made a little movie about it. Have you seen the book? Okay, Elliot Page, you gotta look that one up too. That's one you can't miss that. Okay, we're at the tail end of it now, and then I'm gonna let you have your evening. So thank you for sharing, everybody. Let's actually not do that. Wrong one. That's what I want. Okay. You can still hear me though, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So as a teacher librarian, I am inspired by the work of Rudine Sims Bishop. If you've never read her stuff, that also will be a part of the resources. So Sims Bishop says that resources in classrooms, like the ones I'm hearing about that people are using, and it's so inspiring, are like windows. They can serve as as provocations for intercultural experience. They help our students to read the world, the imagined, the familiar, and the strange. And they help them to walk through that world in their imagination. So that's how resources can be like sliding glass doors. But Bishop says that if the lighting is just right, a window can serve as a mirror. And it's important for learners through the resources that they see themselves, their own lives, their experiences, through resources affirming who they are. So a book like Je suis Ruby, it's important as a book to demonstrate that anti-Black racism is real in society, but it's also important to couple that with books of joy about Blackness, books of joy that celebrate Blackness. And that way, we really provide that mirror for the full experience of what it means to be Black. Here's the resource I wanted to share with you, and the actual full research you'll see in the resources that Kapana shares. But I think this visual really sort of speaks to how students, before they even come to us at 4 years old, you'll see the middle part, have expressions of racial prejudice, and it actually peaks at age 4 and 5. How this was explained to me many years ago, having my own kids, I've got 11-year-old and a 16-year-old and 18-year-old, and I've observed this with my own eyes. As long as kids, babies, are able to tell the difference between hues, as long as they're able to observe behavior and mimic behavior, and then as long as they're able to follow pattern, all those things they're able to do very early on in their life, they can observe and repeat racism. That's all it takes. And if you read more about the various research that you'll see on this slide, you'll understand that racism happens in human beings much earlier than many of us think as teachers. So we have to be prepared to have those conversations with our learners. Other infographics I want to just share with you before I set up like sort of how I approach things with my learners in the library is a little bit about children's books in Canada. So this was from a 2019 survey that only 27% of characters in best-selling books actually in 2008 were either Black or Indigenous or racialized. And so you can see that's a very small percentage as compared to the overwhelmingly over 70% characters that were depicted in children's books that were published that were white. Finally, the last infographic that I'll share with you is about author racial diversity. This is coming out of the States, and a comparison between 2015 and 2019, mostly to respond to people saying, well, things have changed, things are changing, but not fast enough, I think. And so you can see that in terms of book publishing and the race of people who are published by large publishing companies, overwhelmingly, those authors self-identify as white as opposed to other social identities. Okay, so knowing the facts that I cited, a teacher has a test to create intercultural provocations with intention and purpose, guiding our students to get to know and be more aware of themselves and of others, and giving voice to those who are silenced and oppressed, helping students to develop their critical consciousness. The curriculum is actually telling us to move to action. So this is coming from the 2023 curriculum, grade 6, overall expectation C3. But look at this specific expectation. Explain explicit and implicit perspectives communicated in various texts, including including narrative text, and provide any evidence that could suggest bias in those perspectives, and they're asking students to suggest ways to avoid such bias. So a link that I've sent to you talks about challenging the text. And here's some of the questions as a part of that lesson that you can follow. Like it's a full lesson that you can follow to question a text. Like here are things you can ask. Whose voice is omitted? Who has power? Who is the author? What's their agenda? What information is used? Who decides what truth is and what assumptions are being made? Another aspect of the curriculum, I pulled out of the new curriculum, out of the grade 8 curriculum. This specific explanation asks students to analyze how various topics such as diversity, inclusion, accessibility are addressed in texts. Okay, insights and messages conveyed, and identify various perspectives. And this also comes from Teaching for Change. The last challenge one came for Teaching for Change. This is another one. Again, I've included it in your resource package, where we're asking students to consider representations of stereotypes, tokenism, invisibility, self and social identities. Think about what's being left out. In order to have these conversations with students, you've really got to equip them with language and understanding how to frame these concepts that they're observing and also internalizing. In order to name it, that's the only way you can disrupt it. And from very, very young ages. I speak to my grade 1s about stereotyping. We were reading a book where the principal was an old, staunchy white guy who was like overweight and whatnot. And my principal sings, and she's a beautiful singer, and she sings often with the students and for our assemblies and whatnot. And I said to this teacher, the students, I said to them, "This is a bit of a stereotype of a principal, because does this resemble your principal at all?" And the kid said to me, "No, Our principal's a rock star. That's what the kids said to me, which I thought was just hilarious. And I love that she disrupt their concept of principal. Okay. So remember how I said that I'd refer to student identity reflections in our literary discussions? Here are a few examples of things that I've done with my students. So um, with my 2 3s at the beginning of the year, in order to get to know them better, we did identity collages. So I found these little bonhommes at the dollar store, and they went through magazines and pasted and had a collage of all the ways that describe them. So in that, I think they were exploring the concepts of identity and self. And often, and this is a French immersion, both an activity I do in English, but also with the French immersions, I pulled it out of the French curriculum, the FSL curriculum. I asked them questions about characters and how, after having done those identity reflections, how are you similar to characters and how are you different? And I think in FSL that relates very well to ideas about themselves and their friends and their immediate environment, about having communications to talk about familiar topics and using familiar words, because of course when we did those identity collages, we sort of developed a vocabulary in order to describe what they had in their collages. So I read them stories about all characters of all walks of life, ask them to compare the characters, and I think this activity reifies Byrham's skills of interpreting and relating, all while considering the perspectives of the lived perspectives and lived experience of others in non-essentialist, complex ways in order to lead to understanding and empathy. Okay, we're almost at the end. This is what I wanted to show you was the change poems. And a teacher tried this a week ago. They haven't come up with the finished project of their poem. So unfortunately, I don't have one to show you, but let me let the video speak for itself.
Crayola invites you to celebrate creativity. Welcome to Create to Learn projects, writing art-inspired stories, understanding self and others, change poems. Poetry helps us explore our inner selves and see the self we show others. In this activity, you will write poems that describe who you are and how people change. You will need metallic colored pencils, Crayola oil pastels, and a paper pad. Create! Start by talking about the ways you describe yourself and what others might think about you. Use colored pencils and draw upon this information to write personal poems that address how others perceive you. Then use oil pastels to draw over the parts of the poem that are not true, show bias, or generalize. Add new words to show how you have changed and what you want others to know about you. Present. Share the illustrated poems with family and friends. Read them aloud with expression. Discuss how changes in the poems mirror changes in the people. Respond. Use Seek to explore the poems. What different ways can you see yourself? What evidence do you have about how others see you? Explain how you have changed or grown. What do you know about yourself and want others to know? Connect. Art and poetry can help reveal truths and build self-awareness. Change poems help connect emotions, misunderstandings, and behaviors. Crayola invites you and your family to visit Crayola.com for more activities that combine art and writing.
Were you able to see that and hear it?
Yes, yes, it was wonderful.
Good stuff. Okay, awesome. Okay, last two things I'm so happy to share with you. Je suis, that's another, you're going to find that in your resource package. It's some research and an activity that I did with classes that were inspired by the self-portraits of Jean-Michel Basquiat and the different ways that he depicted who he was and the changes in his life. And there's a set of lessons in there talking about how students can sort of be inspired by his work and talk about how they've changed over time and then depict it through art. And then last activity is actually inspired by my Peel good friend, former student from York University grad, award winner, and now Peel FSL teacher, Serena Kentel, who does a lot of work with multi-language learners in her French as a second language classroom. And she integrates all the various languages in her school community as a part of her FSL class, very much showing and demonstrating with much success cultural competence. And this particular writing was written by one of her students when she asked them in her research, when I do this, how does this make you feel? And the student wrote, it makes me feel home. So one of the links that you have is about a language-friendly school and a language-friendly wall and the different activities that she does, and you'll find that in your resource package. And that's it. I'm done. I give you 11 minutes to let me hear all about you and any questions you might have. Before questions, I want to say first, because I want to get it in here, that I want to thank you so much for coming and being a part of this presentation. I really appreciate you. I know it's a long day and we're all exhausted teachers because we put so much into our work. I want to thank the Ontario Teachers Federation by providing these amazing spaces for teachers to get to interact and come together and refine our skills. And so in particular, I want to thank Lindy Amato and Jason Healy, and of course, Kalpana, who is the one who told me all about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Karen?
I had a question.
Please go ahead.
You talked about critical consciousness. I find personally, I teach kindergarten. I find it very difficult, not only with the kindergartners, I also have Black Student Alliance, and I find it very difficult to teach that critical consciousness. We look through our school and we try to have, a continuum, an equity continuum that we look at, and we kind of have these look fors. And the looking at the expectation for higher excellence, the expectation for the cultural competence, but that critical, that conscious awareness, that awakening, that woke, that should be there is very difficult, I find, not only to see, but also for teachers to, in my experience and from what other educators have said to me, to teach.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And remember, Donna, I was saying that my observation of how CRP is sort of practiced in schools, that's the part that I don't see enough. And maybe you're referring to why it is because teachers are framing it as I find it difficult to teach. I'll be honest with you. I think kids come with critical consciousness, and we have to provide the spaces for them to interact with it and talk about it. I think their words, their behavior demonstrates critical consciousness, right? Um, and the work that we're doing around saying even the response to, I don't want to play with you because you're Black, is about heightening students' understanding that, certain, oppressive practices are are real, and ignoring it is by saying, I'm going to constantly sideline this, but going at it head on and saying, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out how we're all going to learn how to live together on this earth. We need to talk about how we're going to create community and mutual respect. And that maybe our behavior is part of something that has been practiced over a period of time and is learned and understood without raising consciousness. And so I'll tell you, after 28 years, I know very few students that aren't aware of that already. Um, it's just about creating the space and being courageous enough to allow those conversations to happen. That's my observation, is that a lot of the reticence to have the conversations don't actually come from the learners. It comes from the teachers being afraid that they don't have the tools to be able to go at it. And then I want you to think about those brave spaces. What's the impact? What's the consequence when we decide to step back and not talk about critical consciousness explicitly?
Do you have resources that you can suggest for myself personally that I can read in order to better understand? Because I try to implement the anti-bias curriculum within my practice, but I
Yes,
find that, and I know that there's a lot of some people. I have a friend who says that, you know what, she's done with the anti-bias curriculum. She wants the anti-oppression
right.
education. But I mean, I try and interweave, but when I get to that, you know, they're able to see that right and wrong, but you want them to be able to see something, name it, and like you said, interrupt it.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I spoke to you about my little friend the other day who was talking about like this isn't right that we have, even homelessness in our city and them seeing it, they're seeing homelessness in ways that I didn't see it when I was their age living in Toronto. Um, again, that student was grade 2. Him bringing that into his space telling me that he's the resource. When he brings it into the space, he's the resource. So if you're asking me what do I have resources to stimulate it, I don't think we have to stimulate it. Kids come with a lot of understandings, particularly if we're talking about um, sociopolitical issues, as long as they're conscious of them, and many of them are. We're in a society where the kids know things about things before we do. We just have to really create the spaces to hear them talk about it. Now, I have been really inspired by the work of Goldie Muhammad most recently. I know people talk about her a lot, but she's not the only one. Um, if you have read the ETFO Anti-Oppressive, I don't know the title of it, Kalpana, maybe you would.
I will find it and put it in the chat.
Great document that is potentially more, I shouldn't want to say practical. It's very pertinent to us as Ontario teachers. A lot of the work that comes out of ETFO, I think, Donna, have you been in it? Have you done those readings workshops?
No, I have not.
Yeah, so I'm gonna really suggest, and I'm sorry, I know you're supposed to be OTF, Kalpana. I don't wanna take you out of your role, but I'm really gonna suggest getting in there and sort of maybe not starting with a book, start with a workshop that's offered by the union, and then stay in touch. I'd love to talk about it more. Since you're doing work with the BSA, I too work with our BSA. It'd be great if all the moderators of BSA come together. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you for joining us for this session. And Karen, thank you for providing so many resources and just room for discussion and allowing us to grow as educators so that we are making the spaces we work in for our students braver spaces so that they can share what they know, because they do come with a lot of knowledge. So thank you for that.
Thank you all. Thank you again for coming.
So in the coming days, we have a couple of follow-up emails you'll receive. You've got the evaluation. As soon as you close the chat, you'll get the evaluation form. So please do complete it for us. We also will have other resources that will be offered by the host or the OTF. And this webinar will be actually on the OTF YouTube page. So if you want to go back and review it and take more notes or share it with your colleagues, you'll have a chance to do that as well. And our next webinar is on April the 9th, 2024 at 4:30 p.m. and it's Teaching Well, Finding Your Path During Challenging Times, Part 1 with Tanya Johnstone. And after that, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening and thank you for joining us this evening. Everyone, take good care.